Okay, so probably the best place to start in any kind of lecture like this is to define what is abnormal, what is considered a disordered behavior, what is considered quote unquote not normal. Now, you'll notice that this section, we are going to focus on a lot of psychological disorders and mental illness. But I want to emphasize that abnormal psychology is not just about mental illness. Okay. For example, criminal behavior. A criminal can do a crime and have no psychological disorder. A person can act out at work and do something completely blatantly wrong and not have a mental disorder. When we review, for example, the psychological profile of individuals who commit mass murder, okay, the majority of them do not have a not diagnosable mental disorder, okay. Do they have mental health issues? Yes, and we'll kind of differentiate between those two. But the point being is when we're talking about abnormal, we're talking about anything that deviates from what is considered normal behavior. Okay. And there's three basic ways that we can kind of see the lens of what would be considered abnormal. The first one is egocentric, and then in between our individual's perception and the broader culture's perceptions, we then have social norms. Okay. So let's start with the egocentric perspective. The egocentric perspective is the idea that we all base what is normal based upon our own experiences and what we as individuals perceive as normal. Then anybody who deviates from our perceptions is considered abnormal. Okay. So, for example, if you have a belief that, oh, let me think, this is just going to be a kind of more, I hope, a fictional example. But if you have a belief that a child under the age of 6 should not be riding a bicycle, and you see a 5-year-old on a bicycle, you then start to think there's something wrong with that child. There's something wrong with those parents that are raising that child. How could they let that child ride a bicycle when they're not at the age of 6 yet? Okay. That's an egocentric perspective where we take our own beliefs and our own ideas, and then we evaluate everyone else's behavior based on those standards. Okay. Now, the egocentric perspective can be fed by social norms and cultural expectations. Okay. Social norms are those things that are within your family and community system that are seen as normal or abnormal. Okay. And an important perspective on this is that an example of different social norms is people who live in urban places versus people who live in rural places. There are two sets of social norms in these areas. For example, in really heavy populated areas like Los Angeles and New York City, when you're walking down the street, it's very abnormal to say hello to everyone you walk by. Okay, it's very abnormal to be very social when you're getting from point A to point B. But in rural communities, it's very normal for a person to walk down the street and nod their head towards their neighbor or towards the storekeeper or the whoever it may be and say hi. And it may be someone they don't even know, um, but they know they're a member of that community. Okay. If you want to try this, if you ever visit New York City, try to say hello to someone walking down the street and you'll understand where I'm coming from if you come from a rural area. Okay. That's an example of social norms. Okay. And probably another good example of social norms is things dealing with religious norms. Okay. And spiritual norms. Other social norms includes beliefs about gender and sexuality. All of those are given to us by our community that we exist from. Okay. Now, both social norms and egocentric norms also are driven by cultural norms. So this is more of the broader areas of life. Okay. And I'll bring up uh, some good example of cultural norms is when we talk about what is a mental illness. Okay, and let's take we'll take a culture. Let's take Western history, but then let's take some modern comparisons in this journey as well. Okay, currently in Western culture, if someone were to say that they're having visions, that they feel like they are the Messiah, maybe they say they see things that other people don't see. In the more Western world, they probably be shot up with Thorazine, okay, or put in some mental health asylum or be seen, or people would just not even approach them, okay. However, there was a time in Western history where people went out and sought individuals who could hear and see things that no one else could see, that felt a sense of grandiosity about who they are, and they were seen as the clerics. They were seen as the people you go to in order to solve your life problems. Okay. And even today, we can see there's cultures still today that put individuals who can see and hear things and have quote unquote visions. And they're the individuals that we go to seek advice in some cultures today. We can see this in some African cultures, some traditions in South America, and even among some of the Native American communities here in the United States. And this is where we also get the conflict between culture and social local norms. Okay. Because one of the biggest issues dealing with Native American communities right now is this need to, or this being forced to adopt a Western mental health model while setting aside traditional ways of healing, which, according to current research, is a really bad idea. Um, and we'll get into that as we move through this section. So right now there's trying to be a balance between Western ideas and more Native American ideas. Not that all Native American communities believe in visions and all those kinds of things. I'm not saying that, but more of this Western idea of medicalization of what is not considered a normal behavior for a normal individual. Okay. So these are different ways that we go through our world and try to address what is normal versus what is abnormal. Okay. And we'll get into some more examples of how this complicates our ability to help people who are suffering from, for example, mental illnesses and those kinds of things as we move through this lecture. Okay. Now, We try to, in psychology, try is the ultimate word there, to objectify what is considered normal versus abnormal. Okay. And so, one way we can look at the difference between normal behavior and abnormal behavior is using statistical analysis. Okay. Whenever you measure something in nature, if you measure it enough times, it will form what is called a bell curve. And we didn't talk much about this because of our shortened semester during the summer. So we really didn't go over statistics and how we measure things in psychology. But there's this theory of the bell curve, and this is true when we measure things like attitudes, beliefs, happiness, sadness, but it's also true when we go measure the growth of plants, the growth of saguaros, the growth. Everything will match this kind of bell curve if we measure it enough, where the majority of individuals are going to lay within what are called the two standard deviations of this bell curve. And anything that lays outside of this is within the third deviation. Okay. And approximately 90% of people are between here, leaving 10% of individuals in these tell areas. Okay. So let's say we're measuring something like sadness and happiness. Okay. So on here we have, on this end, we have extreme sadness. And on this end, we have extreme happiness. Okay. Well, we have two different fields of psychology that study these now, ever since 1999. So about 26 years, we've had two different disciplines that will study these things. Okay. For those individuals that measure this low sad area, this is what we're going to give to our clinical psychologists who are going to study individuals on the low end of a scale to try and develop some type of maybe treatment that could get them or push them more towards the center area. Okay. And then we have people who will study extreme happiness. These people who are in this extreme level of happiness and success and all of those things. These individuals are known as positive psychologists. And what these guys are hoping to do, or these folks, is they're trying to see, by studying these people on this extreme end over here, how can we move the entire population that direction? Okay. So this is one way to kind of think about how we do this. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is we're going to talk about something called the DSM, which when we're dealing with mental illness, which is a diagnostic and statistic manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And what it does is it uses these statistical methodologies, but it also uses these to determine what a mental illness is. So, what is depression? What is anxiety? What is schizophrenia? Okay. And so, but we'll talk more about that as we move along. Okay. Now, what's the difference though between a mental illness and an abnormal behavior or something that is experienced as abnormal? Okay. Well, I hate to say this, even though I hope that the majority of us don't experience things like violence and aggression. The truth of the matter is that the majority of us will experience these abnormal behaviors, if not just once in our life. Okay. We will all experience sadness. We as I mentioned in the sensation and perception section, we all hallucinate every day. Our brain is filling in those blind spots from where there's no sensory receptors in the eye. But we all will at some point in our life, usually when we're experiencing some type of extreme stress, have some type of hallucination, whether it be auditory, visual, or whatnot. Again, irregular behavior is this, and yes, I hate to say it, most of us at some point in our life will experience violence, whether it's a kicking mac with a sibling when we were 5 years old, or being violently harmed by someone in our youth or adults. We'll all experience this. Most of us will experience this, including things like aggression, depressed mood. We'll all experience, we don't like to think it, but we'll all have delusional thinking once in a while. I don't run into very few people when there's in, again, times of stress that they become paranoid, we'll use this term too, about what people are thinking about them. Okay. What's that person thinking about me? Why are they looking at me that way? Okay. So we'll all experience these. And so, in the general field of abnormal psychology, we just like to say, when is it that the majority of us feel sadness? When is it that most of us will feel depression, scared, and anxiety? And why do we do these things? When we get concerned, which we'll get in here in just a few minutes, when we get concerned is when we have a cluster of abnormal behaviors that last over a long period of time. That's when we get concerned that we're going from the normal experience of abnormality that exists in life itself and into the world of mental health and mental illness issues. Okay. So I just kind of want to give that introduction. So we're setting up kind of the idea of how do we define someone who has a mental health issue, someone who is experiencing abnormality versus someone who is experiencing mental illness. Okay. I always have to give this disclaimer before we get into this a little bit more deep, is that please remember lectures like this, especially an introduction to psychology lecture, is of an academic nature to where we can debate different disorders, we can debate mental illness, mental health. But please, if you or someone else is suffering from a mental illness, um, and you see something in these lectures that you start to question it, please go see your provider, your care provider, or seek out help or assistance. Do not stop any type of treatment that you may be going through or any type of medication you're going through due to what you hear in the content of these lectures. These are academics. They're meant to get you thinking about these things. They're not meant to be clinically diagnosing or diagnosable in nature. So I got to put out this disclaimer before we move on. Okay. Okay. So again, the next question we need to define is what is the difference between mental health and mental illness? Okay. Because as I mentioned, a person can have very poor mental health that leads them to do abnormal things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they suffer from a mental illness. Okay. So when we talk about a mental disorder, on this right panel side, this comes directly out of the DSM. which defines a mental illness as a psychological, biological, or developmental process that is underlying functioning that has become disrupted, has become distressful. Okay. But what we'll do is we'll try and summarize this statement with these things that are underlined on the left panel. Okay. A mental illness is a cluster of abnormal behaviors. Okay. So it's, if we look at, for example, depression, it's a loss of motivation. It's a having a low or melancholy mood. It has sleep disruption issues. It has eat disruption issues. It has so there's a cluster of different behaviors or abnormal behaviors that are then being defined or labeled as depression. Okay. And then they have to have these three qualities. They have to be deviant, meaning they're not seen as normal. So normally a person can get up and go to work, go to school, be able to function in their world. But because these are such deviant behaviors, it's like the person has changed. Okay. Based on the onset of those symptoms. The second thing is that they're distressful. Distressful in that they cause the person anxiety, it causes the person worry and concern, and it causes the people around them concern that it's going to lead them to a quote unquote darker place. Okay. The other thing is that it needs to be persistent over time. Okay. And this is important because there are times we will experience, for example, depression as it's defined as a mental disorder. Okay. Usually this will happen when we lose someone close to us. It happens to a lot of men when they retire and they quit their job. It happens when people are fired. It happens when people experience a natural disaster or some type of trauma. Okay. But for the majority of people, about 90% of people, that depression that they experience due to life circumstances usually will go away after about 90 days. The severest of those symptoms will start to abate after about 2 to 3 weeks, even though it will continue on for 90 days. Okay. So it would be a very bad idea to put those individuals in some type of treatment because it's going to naturally abate at someone, and we don't want to label someone with something they don't have, but they're experiencing. Okay. So, one of the major features of mental disorders is that it persists when it's not supposed to persist, meaning that you're depressed even though you are maybe at Disney World or Disneyland. You're experiencing anxiety even though all your bills are paid, your kids are doing good, you're getting straight A's in school, but you still experience those anxiety symptoms. Okay. That's when we get concerned. Okay. But probably most important is that due to that cluster of behaviors, it has become very maladaptive for the individual. So again, they might lose their job. They might stop going to work. They may not be able to focus in class and be able to perform well in class. They might stop taking care of their kids or treating their kids poorly. They may act inappropriate given the social context that they're in. Okay. So it becomes a very maladaptive feature of the individual. Okay. And I'm going to go back to the experience of depression. Most individuals who lose someone and go through the depressive state, that is actually known as an adaptive stage of grief. Okay. It actually is concerning when someone loses someone very, very close to them and they don't experience some type of depression for at least, even if it's just a day or a couple days, because it usually means that they're not processing their grief. Okay. So depression, even if it has all of the clinical features, is an adaptive part of the grieving process. When it becomes maladaptive is when it starts to kind of quote unquote take the person's life over. It hijacks their emotion system. It doesn't, it prevents them from experiencing things like joy and happiness. Okay. And that's the most important feature of what we would consider a mental disorder. Okay. All right. So again, I want to just kind of emphasize the difference between mental health and mental illness, because and I like to uh, uh, make the analogy of physical health because people tend to understand physical health a little bit better. Okay, a person a person with physical health, let's say someone who is physically healthy have these three features in their life. They usually have a healthy diet. They exercise. They tend to abstain from toxins. They do everything in moderation. Okay. So, yeah, they may have an alcoholic drink, but they don't have 5 drinks every night during the week, for example. Yes, they exercise, but they may not, they do everything in moderation. Okay. People who tend to be physically healthy tend to have a growth mindset, healthy self esteem, self-efficacy, which is the belief you can do something, and they engage in their social world and not avoid it. Okay. So they engage in things like preventative care, regular medical care, engage in their social world. Much like physical health, mental health on the biological end is a healthy diet, exercise, especially exercising the brain through problem solving activities, those kind of things, and abstaining from toxins. Okay. Just like physical health, people with good mental health have a growth mindset, healthy self esteem, and self efficacy. And they do thought engaging activities, okay, meaning that they wonder about things, they get curious about things and want to explore the world. And they also have something called an open mindset, meaning that, and this is kind of a personality feature, it's about the ability to integrate new experiences and new information and not be resistant to things like change. Okay. On the mental health end, they have a strong sense of identity and belonging. They have healthy, intimate, and social relationships. And they have engaging preventative social activities. And again, just like with physical health, medical care. So they're very analogous with each other. There's a few that one has that the others don't. But this is the thing about both physical health and mental health. You can have very, very, very poor physical health, but not have a physical disorder. Okay. Just like you can be the healthiest person physically, but still ending up with something like cancer or diabetes or a heart attack. Okay. This is the same thing with mental health. You can have very, very poor mental health, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have a mental illness. Just like you could have very, very strong mental health and live a very mentally engaging life, but still suffer from something like depression or anxiety or psychosis. Okay. Now, with that being said, having poor physical health does increase your probability of a physical illness. So it does increase your chance of getting diabetes or a heart disease or bone disorders or muscle disorders. Absolutely. Just like having very poor mental health increases your probability of getting a mental illness like depression or anxiety or psychosis. Okay. But it's very important to differentiate between the two, because once you label someone with a mental illness, that becomes a defining feature of who they are. When in maybe the reality of it, they just needed to increase their mental health. Okay. And just likewise with physical health, there have been people, okay, and I'll bring this up just like I would with mental health, who have been diagnosed with cancer who did not have cancer. They were misdiagnosed, but their identity as a healthy person became so much about having cancer, they developed cancer. There's people who have been diagnosed with diabetes, who in the end, their results were misread, but all of a sudden now they have type 2 diabetes. There are people who have been told that they have a heart disease, but in the end, they actually never really did. But because of that defining feature that someone gave them, they ended up with heart disease. Okay. The same thing is with mental health, and why we have to be careful with these things is there has been studies, very, in my opinion, unethical studies, where people were purposely misdiagnosed with someone, with something. So they were told they had depression when they didn't have depression. They were told they had an anxiety disorder when they didn't have an anxiety disorder. And in almost all of these studies, the majority of those individuals ended up with clinical anxiety or clinical depression. Okay. So we got to be very careful about these. Joanna, yes, please ask your question. You might be muted, or you could put it in the chat. Yes, absolutely, Joanna. Yes, so that is, again, when we talk about children, it's the same with children as it is with adults. And yes, so we see, especially in early childhood, so self-esteem actually starts to develop very, very young in childhood. And believe it or not, your adolescent and your young adulthood child self-esteem was pretty well set by the age of 3 or 4. And this is just an example, kind of going with what you're saying. And we find it is really based upon the interaction between the parent and the child, and how how the parent relays the child's goodness or badness, I guess. I think that might be a bad term for this. But yeah, there is something wrong with you, and constantly telling a child that can manifest then into, if not a mental illness, definitely mental health issues. Yeah, and that's very common. I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, give me more. Okay. But yeah, so and Joanna brings up a very, very good point that yes, this very much can occur in childhood, not just adulthood. Okay. Um, so yes, yeah, kind of made me melancholy thinking about that. Anyways, so going on, it's important to know the difference between mental health and mental illness because once a person has those labels, um, if they do have the disorder will get worse. Okay, I don't know if you've ever noticed that someone with cancer, once they're diagnosed, within a couple weeks, the cancer has spread more. Okay, um, when I was diagnosed with congestive heart failure, I had to wear what's called a life vest because the concern is once diagnosed with that, the chances of having cardiac arrest multiply. So I had to wear one of those for like a year, so that if I did, it would shock me back to life, I guess is what we call it. But that's a very common thing. And I think we've all kind of experienced this either with ourselves or with individuals that once someone is told that they're sick, they tend to be sicker, even more sick, because it becomes part of their identity. So we have to be very aware of these things. Okay. I do want to just kind of talk a minute about trauma. Okay. And how it influences our physical and mental health. Let me see what time it is. Make sure we have enough time. You know what? I don't know. You know what? No, I don't want to leave this to the last of this class just in case I have to cut it off. I am not comfortable with that because because we're going to talk about trauma, but we're going to talk about something very specific to most Native American communities, and that is historical trauma. And I don't want to leave that to the end of our class where I might have to cut us off because we run out of time. So I'm going to escape out of here, and this is where we'll start tomorrow. So let me uh, get out of here. I'll stop our sharing. Okay, I'm going to leave that. I just really don't feel comfortable leaving that part of that conversation as a cliffhanger if I go too long speaking about trauma and trauma's effects on individuals. So I hope you don't mind if we end class a little bit early today. But does anybody have any questions about the content we went over today? Really, again, today we're just defining things, and then we'll get more into some different effects, but we do need to talk about trauma and trauma effects on our mental health and physical health before we go on. All right, Michael, thank you. Shayna, thank you. Okay, no questions. All right, gang.